Welcome back here to Live Now from Fox on this Tuesday afternoon. This is Andrew Kraft, and we're looking at just some file video that you probably have seen of former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev there. We learned just moments ago he has died at a Moscow hospital at the age of 91. We have a live look, and what we're being told from the Associated Press is outside of that hospital. Also a live now look there in Red Square. You can see the community and Russians across the country reacting to this news. Let's bring in Fox News national security correspondent Jennifer Griffin, who joins us live at the Pentagon with more reaction. Jennifer, good to see you. You know, this I don't think came as a shock to many people. He was 91 years old, but his life and legacy is something to remember, especially from the latter half of the 20th century and the fall of the Soviet Union. What were your first reactions when you heard the news today?
Well, Andrew, it's notable that on the anniversary of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan that we learned that the last leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, has died. He, of course, oversaw the breakup of the Soviet Union 2 years after he pulled Russian troops out of Afghanistan in 1989, after a costly 10-year war that helped hasten the economic collapse of the Soviet Empire. What's interesting is that Gorbachev ended the Cold War without bloodshed, without the loss of life that would typically mark such a cataclysmic moment. It's ironic that he has died while his successor, Russian President Vladimir Putin, pursues the exact opposite ambition, to reunite the Soviet Union by invading Ukraine and attempting to bring it back under Moscow's iron fist. Gorbachev helped remove the Iron Curtain that divided Europe. Putin has mobilized the West, and Europeans united them for the first time in decades in the face of his authoritarian, expansionist delusion about reestablishing the Soviet Union. Unlike Putin, Gorbachev did not send tanks in to quell the pro-democracy protesters in Eastern Europe when the Soviet Union was beginning to collapse, unlike previous Kremlin leaders who crushed the uprisings in Hungary and Czechoslovakia in 1956 and 1968 with Russian tanks and troops. Gorbachev's approach could not stand in greater contrast to Putin's violent attempt to usurp Ukraine. Putin issued a statement moments ago through his spokesman expressing his deepest condolences. It will be interesting to see if Vladimir Putin allows a state funeral or any sort of significant memorialization of Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev may have been a hero in the West and received the Nobel Peace Prize for ending the Cold War. For Putin and many Russian people, he is a villain who led to the humiliating collapse of their empire. From his deathbed, he told a Russian journalist that Putin is reversing his entire legacy by invading Ukraine. 15 Soviet republics sought autonomy when Gorbachev was president as he tried to navigate the transformation of the Soviet Union away from communism, which was bankrupting it. Ukraine was one of those republics. It gained its independence in 1991 while Gorbachev was still president. The independence of those 15 republics resulted from his reforms, from glasnost and perestroika, which Gorbachev had hoped would keep the Soviet Union together. Those countries, as we see in Ukraine, do not want to return to Soviet rule. Gorbachev was vilified by most Russians when we lived in Moscow at the end of the 90s. At that time, Russians faced economic hardship due to the collapse of the Soviet Union, which many Russians to this day, including Putin, view as the humiliating defeat of Russia. That humiliation, Andrew, is one of the reasons many Russians are willing to turn a blind eye to Putin's bloody invasion of Ukraine. Andrew.
Yeah, Jennifer, we're just seeing some video from the late 80s, early 90s of George H.W. Bush and Gorbachev, of Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev, of course, Gorbachev's iconic birthmark there on his forehead. We're also getting reaction in from other leaders here stateside. This tweet we want to put up from Condoleezza Rice. She says, "I'm saddened to hear of the passing of Mikhail Gorbachev. He was a man who tried to deliver a better life for his people. His life was consequential because without him and his courage, it would not have been possible to end the Cold War peacefully." Jennifer, that's kind of one of my questions today. How are everyday Russians going to be reacting to this? Many kind of chalk up and give responsibility to him for the fall of the Soviet Union. Is that going to be on the minds of many of these everyday Russians who are reacting to the news? We have a live now look there in Moscow. It's about 1:30 on a very early Wednesday morning.
I think it will be very interesting, Andrew. I think if you talk about your average Russian, Gorbachev was not held in high esteem because of the propaganda from Putin and others over the years blaming him for the collapse of the Soviet Union. But now, at this moment in time, when it's impossible to speak out against Putin's war in Ukraine, or very difficult given the media censorship, given the punishment of 15 years in prison for speaking out against the war, it will be interesting if some of those people, those Russians who do want to protest the war in Ukraine, use this as an opportunity to step up and perhaps use Mikhail Gorbachev's death as a way to criticize Putin and to contrast to Putin previous leaders like Gorbachev who tried to peacefully save the Russia and who did not try to send tanks and troops into the former Soviet republics. The contrast to Putin couldn't be sharper, and it'll be very interesting to me to see if Russians use this as an opportunity to protest against Putin.
Yeah, and Jennifer, just to follow up on that, I don't know if you can offer, what was the relationship like between Putin and between Gorbachev? And maybe you can offer some details as well about what he did after he left office in his later years. Did he write? Was he an author? Did he appear on TV? Things like that, where we really have not heard from him in some time. Many, didn't know he was in the hospital either. So what has he been doing since leaving power 30 years ago?
Well, he was 91 years old. I remember interviewing him back in the late 90s when I was living in Moscow as a reporter for Fox News. And in those days, remember, Russia was going through a terrible, cataclysmic sort of economic change. The ruble had crashed, people had lost their livelihoods, and they were looking for someone to blame. Vladimir Putin sort of moved in 1999 after Boris Yeltsin stepped aside and became the next president. And again, Gorbachev would have been an easy scapegoat for him. Gorbachev and Putin never had a close relationship. In fact, they are complete opposites. Putin wanted to revive the Russian Empire, the Soviet Empire. And again, that's why he's set his sights on Ukraine. He's been plotting for 20 years of how to try and reestablish the Soviet Union. We're seeing in Ukraine that he may come to a full stop there because the Ukrainian military and the Baltics and other countries don't want him to send Russian troops back in. But I would not say that Gorbachev and Putin had any sort of warm relationship. In fact, I was surprised to see that Putin had put out a statement of condolences upon hearing about his death. That was through his spokesman, Dmitry Peskov. It'll be interesting to see what Putin says publicly and whether he allows a state funeral, as I mentioned. So I think we are in a period of time. You asked about what Gorbachev had done since he left office. He was very quiet in those initial years after he was was no longer president, because again, Russians were going through tumultuous turmoil at home. They didn't view him the way the West viewed him. So he did spend a lot of time traveling in those initial years in the West, teaching at universities, speaking publicly, writing his memoirs. But I think, he was not given the kind of appreciation at home that you would have expected for such a historic figure.
Yeah, I was just looking at some of the reaction on Twitter. C-SPAN just posted a video of him appearing in the Capitol Rotunda in Statuary Hall, paying his respects to then late President Ronald Reagan upon his passing back in 2004. But it's so interesting. Just lastly, you noted how history is really circular. Back in the 90s, glasnost and perestroika, words that we really haven't heard a lot about recently. And that was the kind of foray, the opening into the West, ultimately led to the fall of the Soviet Union. But you're seeing, like you mentioned, the exact opposite, where now Russia has become a very insular place, a global pariah, if you will. And so I just was kind of commenting, noting on those kind of historical patterns there. We also have a tweet we just want to put up as well. This is from the Ronald Reagan Foundation with a picture of Reagan and Gorbachev. It says, the Reagan Foundation and Institute mourns the loss of former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, a man who once was a political adversary of Reagan's, who ended up becoming a friend. Our thoughts and prayers go out to the Gorbachev family and the people of Russia. Jennifer, just lastly, I'll be on the lookout to see, how everyday Russians, how the Russian state leaders there commemorate this loss.
I agree, Andrew. It will be very interesting. And again, I think this is a moment, and as you mentioned, Vladimir Putin and his policies and his invasion of Ukraine could not be further from. They are the opposite of glasnost and perestroika. Russia is going back into its xenophobic, historic past, and it is not open, it is not reforming. And Mikhail Gorbachev was the opposite of Vladimir Putin. He will be remembered as such in the history books, but it will be very interesting to see how he's memorialized in Russia at this very moment in time.
All right, Fox News senior affairs correspondent Jennifer Griffin at the Pentagon for us. Jennifer, thanks so much for offering your thoughts today.